The radio crackled at 3:47 hours with a transmission that would haunt the Pentagon for years. "Overlord, this is Reaper 1. We have eyes on the target, requesting immediate close air support." The voice belonged to Master Chief Petty Officer Marcus Vega, leader of SEAL Team 6's most classified unit, and the tremor in his steady baritone told the story no briefing ever could. They were in serious trouble. 3 hours earlier, the mission had been declared impossible. The intelligence was razor-thin. A high-value target holed up in a compound nestled between two mountain ridges in the Hindu Kush, accessible only by a narrow valley that funneled aircraft into a natural kill zone. Anti-aircraft batteries dotted the surrounding peaks like deadly flowers, their radar signatures painting the night sky in lethal geometric patterns. The terrain funneled everything into a gauntlet of death that had already claimed two Apache helicopters and their crews the week prior. "No fixed-wing assets can operate in that environment," Colonel James Morrison had declared during the emergency briefing, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of tactical displays. "The valley is a coffin. We'd be sending pilots to die." The room had fallen silent except for the hum of encrypted communications and the distant thrum of rotors on the tarmac outside. Every pilot in the briefing room understood the mathematics of their trade. Altitude plus speed equals survival, but this mission demanded the opposite: low, slow, and exposed. That's when Captain Zara Whiskey Nakamura had stood up from her corner seat, her slight frame casting a long shadow across the mission boards. At 5'4" and barely weighing 130 soaking wet, she looked more like a college student than a combat pilot with over 200 combat sorties under her belt. The room had turned toward her, some faces curious, others dismissive. She'd felt their eyes cataloging her appearance. The too young face, the regulation-short black hair that never quite stayed in place, the call sign patches that read like a resume most of them couldn't match. "Sir," she'd said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with surgical precision, "I can put ordnance on target." The silence that followed felt dense enough to walk on. Morrison's eyebrows had climbed toward his hairline. Behind him, the mission clock continued its relentless countdown, each second ticking away another opportunity to save the SEAL team that was already infiltrating toward an objective that might cost them everything. Now, 6 hours into what should have been a 12-hour operation, Vega's desperate transmission confirmed everyone's worst fears. The SEALs were pinned down, casualties mounting, extraction impossible. The valley had become exactly what Morrison predicted: a killing ground where the mountains themselves seemed to harbor malice. But somewhere above the clouds, engines were already turning, and Whiskey Nakamura was suiting up for a mission that would either save 6 American lives or add another name to the memorial wall at Bagram Airfield. Captain Nakamura's hands moved through the pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, each switch and gauge a familiar friend in the cockpit of her. Thunderbolt II. The aircraft sat hunched on the tarmac like a mechanical predator, its massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from the nose like the snout of some prehistoric beast. In the pale glow of the instrument panel, her reflection showed none of the doubt that churned in her stomach. This wasn't her first impossible mission, but something about tonight felt different, final somehow. "Whiskey Tower, you are cleared for takeoff, runway 27, Godspeed." The tower operator's voice carried an unusual weight. Word had already spread through the base about the SEAL team's predicament, about the pilot crazy enough to attempt what seasoned commanders had declared suicide. As her twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up to full military power, Nakamura felt the familiar surge of controlled violence that came with 10,000 pounds of thrust pressing her into the ejection seat. The A-10 lifted off into the Afghan night like an iron-gray ghost, climbing slowly toward the mountains that dominated the eastern horizon. Behind her, Bagram Air Base spread out in a constellation of runway lights and hardened aircraft shelters, a small beacon of American military might in a landscape that had devoured empires for millennia. At 15,000 feet, she leveled off and began her approach toward coordinates that existed only in classified databases and the nightmares of mission planners. Reaper 1, this is Hog 77, inbound your position with 30 Mike and rockets. ETA your location, 15 minutes. Her radio call was answered immediately by Vega's strained voice. Hog 77, Reaper 1. We are taking effective fire from multiple positions along the ridgeline. We have 2 urgent surgical and 1 routine surgical. Extraction is not possible at this time. The coded language painted a grim picture. 2 critically wounded, 1 less severely hurt, no way out. The SEALs were trapped in a canyon that had become their tomb, surrounded by enemy fighters who held every tactical advantage. Standard operating procedure would be to wait for dawn, bring in overwhelming firepower, level the entire valley. But by dawn, the SEALs would be dead or captured, either outcome unacceptable to the warrior code that bound American Special Operations Forces together. As her aircraft passed through 12,000 feet, descending toward the mouth of the valley, Nakamura's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. All stations, this is Overlord. Be advised, mission parameters have changed. Weather is deteriorating rapidly. Abort mission and return to base immediately. The order came from Colonel Morrison himself, transmitted directly from the Tactical Operations Center, where real-time satellite imagery showed cloud cover building over the target area like a deadly blanket. For a long moment, the only sound in her cockpit was the steady drone of her engines and the whisper of air over control surfaces. Below, the mountains rose toward her like the jagged teeth of some slumbering giant. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human drama playing out in the thin air beneath them. This was the moment every pilot dreaded and prepared for. The choice between following orders and following conscience, between institutional safety and the brotherhood that bound warriors across service lines. Captain Nakamura reached for her radio transmit switch. What she said next would define not just this mission, but the legacy she left behind in the cockpit of an aircraft that was built for one purpose: bringing American warriors home alive, no matter the cost. Overlord Hog 77, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Negative on abort. American lives are at stake. I have fuel and ordnance and I'm going in. The silence that followed her transmission seemed to stretch across eternity. She could imagine Morrison in the TOC, his jaw clenched tight, surrounded by staff officers who were already calculating the political fallout of losing an A-10 and its pilot to what amounted to an unsanctioned rescue mission. 20 miles ahead, the mouth of the valley opened like a wound in the earth. Intelligence reports indicated at least 4 separate anti-aircraft sites nested in the surrounding ridges, each equipped with Zu-23 autocannons and possibly shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. Her aircraft's titanium bathtub could stop most small arms fire, but a direct hit from anti-aircraft artillery would turn her Warthog into a fireball visible from 3 provinces away. She descended to 8,000 feet, then 6,000, her altitude unwinding like thread from a spool. The radar warning receiver remained ominously quiet. Either the enemy wasn't actively scanning, or they were waiting for her to commit to the valley before lighting her up like a Christmas tree. Both possibilities made her skin crawl, but there was no backing down now. Somewhere below, 6 American warriors were counting on her to perform a miracle that violated every principle of tactical aviation. Reaper 1 Hog 77, preparing to enter the valley from the south. I need you to mark your position with infrared strobes and keep your heads down. This is going to get loud. Vega's response came back immediately. Copy, Hog 77. Strobes are hot. We are marked with orange panels. Danger close is 50 meters. How copy? The distance was impossibly tight for 30mm cannon fire, requiring precision that would make a surgeon jealous. At 4,000 feet above ground level, Nakamura armed her weapons systems. The master arm switch clicked into the ON position with a definitive snap, followed by the subtle whine of the GAU-8 cannon's hydraulic system pressurizing. 1,100 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium ammunition sat ready to be fed through 7 rotating barrels at a rate of nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. Each round weighed almost 2 pounds and could punch through armored vehicles like they were made of tissue paper. The valley walls began to rise around her aircraft like the sides of a tomb. At this altitude and speed, she had perhaps 30 seconds to identify targets, engage, and escape before the inevitable barrage of anti-aircraft fire turned her bird into scrap metal. Her hands tightened on the stick as the first muzzle flashes began to wink at her from the darkness ahead. The dance of death was about to begin, and everything she'd trained for in her 8 years of military service would be tested in the next 60 seconds. The first burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted from a ridge position 2 miles ahead, bright orange tracers arcing through the night sky like deadly fireworks. Nakamura jinked hard left, pulling 4 Gs as her aircraft groaned under the stress. The titanium armor beneath her seat sang with the impact of small arms fire, but the A-10's legendary durability kept her airborne and fighting. Through her night vision goggles, she could see muzzle flashes scattered across both ridges, at least a dozen separate positions, far more than intelligence had predicted. Hawk 7-7 taking effective fire, multiple AAA positions mark my smoke. She triggered a white phosphorus rocket into a cluster of enemy positions, the brilliant explosion illuminating the valley in stark relief. For a moment, the landscape was frozen like a battlefield photograph, rocky outcroppings bristling with weapons, tiny figures scrambling for cover, and far below, the infrared strobes marking friendly positions glowing like lifelines in the darkness. Her targeting system locked onto the largest concentration of muzzle flashes. Gun run inbound, danger close. Reaper 1, stay down. The GAU-8 cannon erupted in a sustained burst that shook her entire aircraft. 30mm rounds chewed through rock and flesh with equal efficiency, silencing 2 enemy positions in a span of seconds. But her attack run had revealed her location to every hostile fighter in the valley, and the return fire was immediate and devastating. A Zu-23 autocannon opened up from her 3 o'clock position, sending a stream of 23mm rounds past her canopy close enough that she could see their glow through her peripheral vision. She rolled inverted and pulled through the bottom of a barrel roll, using the valley walls to mask her escape while simultaneously lining up for another attack run. The maneuver was textbook dangerous. At low altitude with mountains on both sides, any mistake would result in controlled flight into terrain, the aviation euphemism for flying into a mountain at 300 knots. Reaper 1 Hawk 7-7, I need a target update. Where's your biggest problem? Vega's voice crackled back through static and the sound of gunfire. Hawk 7-7, we've got a heavy machine gun position directly north of our location, approximately 300 meters. That position is keeping us pinned. We can't move with wounded. The coordinates he provided put the target on a ridgeline barely 50 meters from the SEAL team's position, well within the danger zone for 30mm cannon fire. Nakamura's mouth went dry as she contemplated the shot. A few degrees off target, and she'd be putting American Special Operations soldiers in the ground with friendly fire. But leaving that position intact meant watching those same soldiers die from enemy action. It was the kind of choice that separated combat pilots from everyone else. The willingness to risk everything, including the lives of those you're trying to save, for the chance to bring everyone home. She rolled into her attack heading, the A-10's nose pointing directly at coordinates that existed only as numbers on a GPS display, and the desperate hope of 6 Americans who had volunteered for a mission everyone knew was impossible from the beginning. The machine gun position revealed itself with a long burst of tracer fire that seemed to reach directly for her cockpit. Nakamura steadied her aircraft in a shallow dive, the targeting pipper on her heads-up display creeping toward the source of the muzzle flashes. At this distance, she could see individual figures moving among the rocks, the thermal signature of their weapons glowing white-hot through her targeting system. One squeeze of the trigger would end their threat permanently. "Guns, guns, guns," she called over the radio, announcing her firing pass to every friendly unit in the area. The GAU-8 cannon spoke with its characteristic sound, a deep, resonant buzz that pilots described as the sound of God clearing his throat. 30mm rounds impacted the ridgeline in a walking line of destruction that lasted exactly 2.3 seconds and expended 67 rounds of ammunition. The machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of pulverized rock and smoke. But her attack run had cost her altitude and airspeed, leaving her exposed to the remaining enemy positions scattered throughout the valley. A shoulder-fired missile streaked past her left wing, close enough that she felt the heat through her canopy. She pulled hard right, trading what little altitude she had remaining for angular velocity, trying to deny the remaining shooters a clean targeting solution while simultaneously searching for her next target. "Reaper 1, status report," she called while pulling 5 Gs in a climbing turn that pressed her deep into her ejection seat. Vega's response was immediate. "Machine gun position destroyed. Outstanding shooting, Hog 7-7. We're moving to extract the wounded now." The relief in his voice was palpable, but Nakamura knew the mission was far from over. Getting the SEALs out of their current position was only the first step. They still needed a clear path to the extraction point, and the valley remained infested with enemy fighters. A new voice entered the radio net, calm and professional despite the chaos erupting around them. "Hawk 7-7, this is Dustoff 7-2. Inbound your location with medical evacuation capability. What's your assessment of the landing zone?" The medevac helicopter was taking an enormous risk entering the valley while anti-aircraft fire was still active, but wounded American soldiers changed the calculus of acceptable risk for every unit in theater. Nakamura keyed her radio while scanning for remaining threats. "Dustoff 7-2, be advised the LZ is still hot. I'm working to suppress remaining AAA positions, but you're going to be taking fire on approach." The helicopter pilot's response was exactly what she expected from the kind of aviator who volunteered for medical evacuation duty in Afghanistan. "Copy all, Hog 7-7. We're coming in anyway. Those boys need medical attention, and we're not leaving Americans behind." The next 5 minutes would determine whether 8 American aircrew and special operations soldiers returned home alive, or whether their names joined the growing list of casualties from a war that had already lasted longer than World War II. And at the center of it, all flew a pilot whose call sign carried a story that nobody in the valley that night fully understood, but everyone was about to witness in action. Captain Nakamura rolled into another attack run, this time targeting a suspected surface-to-air missile site that intelligence had marked as a primary threat to the incoming medevac helicopter. Her aircraft shuddered as more small arms fire found its mark against the A-10's armored hull, but the Warthog continued flying with the stubborn persistence that had made it legendary among ground forces worldwide. Through her night vision system, she could see the SEAL team moving across the valley floor, carrying their wounded toward the designated landing zone with the methodical efficiency that marked elite special operations units. The SAM site announced itself with a radar-locked tone that filled her headset with electronic urgency. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a missile operator was tracking her aircraft, waiting for the perfect moment to send a heat-seeking projectile into her engine exhaust. She had seconds to either destroy the threat or die trying, and the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. "Rifle," she called, announcing the launch of an AGM-65 Maverick missile from her wing pylon. The weapon's infrared seeker head had locked onto the heat signature of the SAM site's generator, and the missile streaked toward its target with electronic determination. The explosion illuminated half the valley, temporarily turning night into day and revealing the full scope of enemy positions that had been hidden in darkness. What she saw in that moment of artificial daylight made her blood freeze. At least 20 separate fighting positions dotted the ridges around the valley, each one occupied by fighters who had been waiting patiently for exactly this scenario. The SEALs had walked into a trap, and she had followed them in, just as the enemy had planned. But there was no backing down now, not with wounded Americans on the ground and a medevac helicopter inbound to a landing zone that remained contested. Her radio crackled with Vega's voice, urgent but controlled. Hawk 7-7, we have movement in the rocks above the LZ. Multiple personnel with what appears to be an RPG. Can you engage? The target he described was less than 30 meters from where the helicopter would have to land, close enough that even a near miss with rocket-propelled grenades could down the medevac bird and kill everyone aboard. Nakamura rolled into a knife-edge turn that brought her nose around toward the coordinates Vega had provided. At this altitude, flying between mountain ridges in the darkness, she was operating at the absolute limits of what fixed-wing aircraft could accomplish in mountainous terrain. One mistake, one moment of vertigo or spatial disorientation, and she'd become another crater in the Afghan landscape. But the alternative, watching Americans die because she was unwilling to take risks, was simply unacceptable to everything she'd sworn to uphold when she pinned on her wings 8 years earlier. The RPG team was moving across a boulder field above the landing zone, their thermal signatures clearly visible through her targeting system, despite their attempts at concealment. These weren't the poorly trained insurgents that dominated most enemy contact reports from Afghanistan. Their movement patterns and tactical discipline suggested professional military training, possibly foreign advisors who understood exactly how to exploit the terrain advantages the valley provided. She lined up her shot with the cold precision that had earned her the grudging respect of infantry units across 3 deployments. The targeting pipper settled on the center of the enemy formation, and her finger tightened on the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon erupted in a burst that lasted exactly 1.7 seconds and expended 43 rounds of 30mm ammunition. The boulder field where the RPG team had been moving disappeared in a cloud of dust and fragmented stone, the threat neutralized with surgical precision. But her low altitude and straight-line attack run had made her a perfect target for the remaining anti-aircraft positions scattered throughout the valley. A Zu-23 autocannon opened fire from directly ahead, sending a stream of 23mm rounds toward her cockpit with deadly accuracy. Nakamura yanked her stick hard left and down, diving toward the valley floor while simultaneously deploying chaff and flares to confuse any heat-seeking missiles that might be tracking her exhaust signature. The A-10 groaned under the stress of the violent maneuver, but its robust construction kept her airborne and fighting. Dustoff 7-2, you are clear for approach to the LZ. Threat north of the landing zone has been neutralized. Her transmission was immediately acknowledged by the helicopter pilot. Copy, Hog 7-7. We have the zone in sight and are beginning our descent. Estimate 3 minutes to touchdown. 3 minutes might as well have been 3 hours. The remaining enemy positions would concentrate their fire on the vulnerable helicopter, and there was no way a single A-10 could suppress every threat in the valley simultaneously. She keyed her radio for what might be her final transmission of the mission. All stations, this is Hog 7-7. I'm going to make multiple attack runs to keep enemy heads down during the extraction. Dustoff 7-2, get in fast and get out faster. This place is about to get very unhealthy. The helicopter pilot's response was terse but confident. Roger that, Hog 7-7. We'll be quick. What followed was 5 minutes of aerial combat that would be studied at air war colleges for decades to come. Captain Nakamura flew her through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire with a skill and determination that defied every probability calculation the enemy had made about American air power in confined terrain. She rolled inverted between mountain peaks, pulled negative G loads that made her vision tunnel, and fired her cannon with a precision that bordered on supernatural. When the medevac helicopter lifted off with 6 SEAL team members aboard, including 2 on stretchers, the valley fell silent except for the distant drone of turbine engines climbing toward safety. Nakamura's A-10 followed them out, its aluminum skin perforated with bullet holes but its pilot and passenger compartment intact. Behind them, the Hindu Kush returned to the ancient silence that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, indifferent to the human drama that had played out in its shadows. But this story was far from over. What happened next would transform Captain Zara Nakamura from just another pilot into a legend that would be whispered in ready rooms and briefing facilities, wherever American military aviators gathered. Her call sign, Whiskey, carried a history that traced back to her first deployment, when she'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely warriors carry the heaviest burdens with the most grace. The flight back to Bagram Air Base gave Nakamura time to process what had just happened in the valley. Her aircraft had taken significant damage, 17 separate bullet holes in the fuselage, hydraulic fluid weeping from multiple systems, and her left engine running rough from what sounded like foreign object damage. But she was alive, her aircraft was flyable, and 8 American military personnel were returning home instead of becoming casualty statistics. As she approached the traffic pattern at Bagram, her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Hawk 77 Tower, be advised you have priority handling for emergency landing. Crash and rescue is standing by. She glanced at her instruments and realized that what she'd interpreted as battle damage might be more serious than initially thought. Her left engine was indeed running rough, and her hydraulic pressure was slowly bleeding away despite her efforts to isolate the damaged systems. Tower Hog 77, aircraft is controllable at this time. Request normal approach and landing. The tower operator's response carried concern that was unusual for experienced controllers. Hog 77, recommend you consider the arrested approach due to your hydraulic situation. The suggestion made sense. If her flight controls failed during landing roll, the aircraft's tailhook could snag an emergency cable and bring her to a controlled stop. But Nakamura had been flying the A-10 long enough to know her aircraft's capabilities even when damaged. The Warthog had been designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, and tonight's mission had proven that design philosophy in the most dramatic way possible. She configured for a normal approach, running through emergency procedures with the methodical precision that separated professional military aviators from everyone else. As her damaged aircraft descended through pattern altitude, she could see the entire base spread out beneath her landing lights. Hardened aircraft shelters, taxiways lined with fighter jets, and the control tower standing like a beacon against the Afghan night. This was the closest thing to home that American military personnel had in this ancient land, and tonight it looked more beautiful than any city skyline she'd ever seen. Hawk 77, you are cleared to land runway 27. Wind is calm, visibility unrestricted. Welcome home. The tower operator's words carried emotion that was rarely heard in routine aviation communications. Word of her single-handed rescue of a SEAL team had already spread through the base communication network, and everyone who worked the flight line knew they were watching something extraordinary conclude. Her main landing gear touched down on the runway centerline at exactly 147 knots indicated airspeed, the touchdown so smooth it barely registered through her damaged aircraft structure. As her nosewheel settled onto concrete and she began her landing roll, Nakamura allowed herself the first smile she'd worn in 6 hours. Behind her, the Hindu Kush stood silhouetted against stars that had witnessed this drama, with the same indifference they'd shown to every human conflict for millennia. But the real story of why Captain Nakamura's call sign was Whiskey was about to be revealed to a base full of military personnel who had heard rumors but never understood the truth. And that truth would change how everyone viewed not just this mission, but the entire philosophy of what it meant to leave no one behind. The base operations center was buzzing with activity when Nakamura finally shut down her engines and began her post-flight inspection. Maintenance crews swarmed over her aircraft, cataloging battle damage and marveling at the fact that she'd managed to keep an A-10 flyable with 17 bullet holes and multiple system failures. But the real attention was focused on the pilot who had just completed what senior officers were already calling one of the most audacious rescue missions in modern military aviation. Colonel Morrison appeared at her aircraft as she was completing her post-flight walk-around, his weathered face unreadable in the harsh glare of the flight line lighting. Behind him stood Master Chief Vega, still wearing his combat gear, but now sporting a field dressing on his left arm where shrapnel had found its mark during the firefight. The SEAL's presence meant that the rescue team had already been debriefed, and the initial reports were making their way up the chain of command. "Captain Nakamura," Morrison said, his voice carrying a formality that didn't quite mask his concern, "I need to see you in my office immediately." The request wasn't unexpected. She had, after all, directly disobeyed a direct order to abort the mission. But the presence of Master Chief Vega suggested this might not be the disciplinary action she was preparing herself to face. As they walked across the tarmac toward the operations building, Vega fell into step beside her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from radio transmissions and combat stress, "I need you to know that what you did tonight saved 6 American lives. Whatever happens next, my team and I will never forget that." His words carried the weight of absolute sincerity that came from shared combat experience. The operations building was nearly empty at this hour, with only essential personnel manning the communication centers and flight monitoring stations that kept American air operations running around the clock. Their footsteps echoed through corridors lined with mission boards and casualty reports, the institutional memory of a war that had been grinding on for nearly 2 decades. Morrison's office was spartanly decorated with the kind of functional efficiency that marked career military officers. A few commendation certificates on the wall, a photograph of him with his flight crew from his own combat days, and a coffee cup that had clearly seen better decades. He gestured for both Nakamura and Vega to sit, then settled behind his desk with the careful deliberation of someone who was about to make decisions that would affect multiple careers. "Captain," he began, his gray eyes fixed on her face, "you directly disobeyed my order to abort the mission. Under normal circumstances, that would result in court-martial proceedings and the end of your military career." The words hung in the air between them like an unexploded ordnance, dangerous and potentially devastating. But Morrison wasn't finished. "However, Master Chief Vega has provided me with a detailed briefing about the tactical situation his team faced and the precision with which you provided close air support in conditions that I would have considered impossible for fixed-wing aircraft." He paused, consulting notes that had been hastily scrawled during Vega's debrief. Danger close fire missions at 50 meters, multiple attack runs in a confined valley, and the destruction of threats that would have made medical evacuation impossible. Vega leaned forward in his chair, his intense gaze fixed on Morrison. "Sir, with respect, Captain Nakamura's actions tonight represent the finest example of close air support I've witnessed in 15 years of special operations. Her call sign might be whiskey, but there's nothing about her flying or her judgment that suggests anything other than absolute professional competence." The mention of her call sign hung in the air between them, and Nakamura felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. This was always the moment when the story came out, when people learned why a pilot with her record carried a call sign that suggested something entirely different from the reality of her service. Morrison's expression softened slightly, and he leaned back in his chair with the air of someone who was about to reveal information that would change the entire context of their conversation. "Captain Nakamura," he said carefully, "I think it's time we discussed how you earned your call sign and why tonight's mission was exactly the kind of operation you were born to fly." The story of call sign Whiskey began 3 years earlier, during Nakamura's first deployment to Afghanistan with the 354th Fighter Squadron. She had been the new pilot in the unit, fresh out of advanced training, and eager to prove herself in an operational environment where mistakes were measured in American casualties rather than training grades. Like most new combat pilots, she had expected her call sign to emerge from some moment of professional accomplishment or embarrassing mistake that would follow her for the rest of her career. Instead, it came from a moment of devastating personal loss that nearly ended her military service before it truly began. The story started with a phone call that reached her in the middle of a routine combat air patrol over the Kandahar province. A call that informed her that her younger brother Jake had been killed by an improvised explosive device while serving with the 82nd Airborne Division near Mosul, Iraq. Jake Nakamura had been 22 years old, a paratrooper who had volunteered for a deployment that put him in harm's way because he believed in the mission and trusted the training that the Army had given him. He was also Zara's only remaining family. Their parents had been killed in a car accident when she was 19 and he was 16, leaving them to navigate the world as each other's only constant support. The notification came through official channels with the clinical precision that the military used to shield itself from the emotional weight of such messages. Jake had been riding in the lead vehicle of a convoy that was providing humanitarian supplies to a remote village when an explosively formed penetrator tore through the armor plating and killed him instantly. There had been no suffering, the casualty notification officer assured her, no prolonged agony or desperate final moments. But for Zara, the clinical details couldn't mask the crushing reality that the person she loved most in the world was gone, taken by the same kind of conflict that had brought her to Afghanistan. The Army had trained them both, equipped them both, and sent them both to separate wars in the same global conflict. Only one of them was coming home. The night after she received the notification, she had sat in her quarters with a bottle of single malt whiskey that another pilot had given her as a deployment gift months earlier. She had intended to drink herself into unconsciousness, to find some temporary escape from grief that felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Instead, she had held the bottle for 3 hours without taking a single drink, staring at Jake's photograph and making a promise that would define the rest of her military career. She promised her dead brother that every mission she flew would honor his memory, that every close air support sortie would be executed with the precision and dedication that he had brought to his own service. She promised that no American ground unit would ever suffer casualties because she was unwilling to take risks, and no rescue mission would fail because she lacked the courage to fly into danger. The whiskey bottle had remained unopened, but the call sign stuck when other pilots saw her holding it during the darkest moment of her deployment. Whiskey didn't refer to drinking or any failure of professional conduct. It referred to the promise she had made while holding that bottle, a vow that transformed personal grief into professional excellence. Every pilot in the squadron eventually learned the story, and the call sign became a mark of respect rather than ridicule. When ground units requested close air support and heard "Whiskey, check in" on the radio, they knew they had a pilot who would rather die than let them down. Morrison finished recounting the story with the kind of quiet respect that senior officers reserved for the most serious aspects of military service. Vega had listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful as he understood the connection between personal loss and professional dedication that had brought Nakamura to their rescue in the Hindu Kush Valley. "That's why," Morrison continued, "tonight's mission represents everything your call sign stands for. You risked your life and your career to save American soldiers because that's what you promised your brother you would do. The SEALs said the mission was too risky, and they were right by conventional standards. But you and your A-10 skimmed that river at night because some promises are more important than safety regulations." Vega stood up and extended his hand toward Nakamura with the formal precision of a senior non-commissioned officer recognizing excellence. "Ma'am, I need you to know that my team and I understand exactly what you did tonight and why you did it. Your brother would be proud of the pilot you've become and the promises you've kept in his memory." The handshake between the SEAL Master Chief and the Air Force captain lasted only a moment, but it represented the kind of mutual respect that transcended service rivalries and connected warriors across all branches of the American military. They had both seen the face of combat, both understood the weight of promises made to the dead, and both recognized that some missions required risking everything for the chance to bring everyone home. Morrison cleared his throat and returned to the business of military administration. Captain Nakamura, you will not face court-martial for your actions tonight. Instead, you'll be receiving a commendation for valor under fire, and your mission will be written up as a case study in close air support operations in confined terrain. What you accomplished tonight has rewritten the tactical manual for A-10 operations in mountainous environments. But the real recognition came from Vega, who had spent 15 years in special operations and understood better than anyone what it meant to have close air support that could be trusted absolutely. "Ma'am," he said as they prepared to leave Morrison's office, "if my team ever finds itself in trouble again, there's no other pilot we'd rather have watching over us. Your call sign means something to ground units throughout this theater, and after tonight, it's going to mean even more." The sun was beginning to rise over the Hindu Kush as they walked back across the flight line toward Nakamura's damaged A-10. Maintenance crews were still working on the aircraft, documenting battle damage and preparing repair estimates that would keep her bird grounded for at least a week. But wow,